Matthew 16:5. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Oh boy, how many times have I gone on a trip and moving too far, down the road to turn around and go back, and I realize, oh, I forgot. So that's what happened to the disciples. You can probably relate to that. But anyway, verse 6. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus was, one of the things that he does over and over again is say things that the disciples don't pick up. They just don't get it. Boy, that sounds a lot like me. In verse 7, they discussed this among themselves and said, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." No, but that's the best they could do, I guess. Jesus, verse 8, aware of their discussions, Jesus asked, "You have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, okay, I think I hear others with this issue too. We take a statement made directly by Jesus to the disciples and we try to apply it universally. Well, there's a principle here that I think could be universal. And yet I want to bear in mind, this is an example of Jesus working directly with the 12 when he says, be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So what were the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Well, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they diverged at one point, and that was the point of the supernatural, the non-material. The Sadducees believed there was no such thing as angels, demons. They even disbelieved an afterlife. They were, I don't know exactly how to pin them down, but they believed in God, and they were probably equally as strict about the law and the commandments as the Pharisees, who were exceedingly strict about those things. And yet, there was no, it was kind of like, this is it, this life, that's all there is. Because when you die, you die. Well, okay. If I had been a disciple, I probably would have pretty easily have pushed that one aside. And the reason, a big reason, is because I'd seen Jesus do all kinds of supernatural things. So that, I don't think, was what Jesus was talking about. I think it was where the Pharisees and Sadducees agreed. The law was the point. The law, keeping the law, obeying the commands, and kind of policing everybody else about it. Was it wrong for them to want to obey the law, obey the commandments? Well, no. The problem was, if I get it right, and I think I do, what had become more important to them than an actual love for God was a love for the law. And one of the difficulties of that kind of thing, if I am more in love with the law itself than the giver of the law, then it doesn't take any imagination to cross over into a legalism that is all about, I think I measure up better than you, and I think that gives me a right to judge you. You can, in my experience, I've never been able to separate legalism from judgmentalism. The legalists that I've encountered were judgmental. Sometimes, I was almost going to say they were judgmental of everybody else, and that's not true. Because some of the legalists in my life have been equally as judgmental of themselves, and they lived in a constant state of fear, anxiety, and guilt. Because what if I even unknowingly, unwittingly violated one of the commands? What if I've got one unconfessed sin? That was my mom. She lived in a constant state of guilt and anxiety because of it. She loved God. There was no question. She loved God. She loved Jesus. And yet, she'd been unable to pull into her own life the grace of God that says it's not about keeping the rules anymore. The grace of God says it kind of flips it absolutely flips the Sadducees and the Pharisees on their head, so that now you don't get this connection with God by obeying the commandments. You obey the commandments because of your connection with God. Well, the apostles again, I don't want to be judgmental of the apostles, but they were a little bit thick-headed. Verse 13, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? And bear in mind, this moniker, the Son of Man, Jesus used this to refer to himself all the time throughout the Gospel of Matthew and all the other Gospels as well. In verse 14, they replied, some say John the Baptist, which, even Herod, who had killed John the Baptist, thought Jesus had come back as John the Baptist because of the supernatural that he had seen. How could that? Well, okay. Others say Elijah. Elijah was one of the supreme prophets for the Jew. That was a very high compliment to say, your Elijah was a huge compliment. And still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. In other words, there were more ideas about who Jesus was out there. But what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? And then Peter, for all the times that he stepped in it, all the times that he opened his mouth and inserted his foot, this is the time we got it right. Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The Christ. not just Jesus's middle name or last name, right? It was it was a description, the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the promised one, the one and only Christ, the Son of the living God. This is called the Good Confession. And in the tradition I've grown up in and still hold to, at baptism, one of the confessions I ask people to make is, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? And they say yes. And I say, well, repeat that after me. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's become so much a part of my vocabulary, I don't think about it much. I don't ponder it. But for the disciples, this was a big, big deal. For Jesus to be the Messiah, the Christ, the authentic one, well, they'd been looking for the Christ, Israel had, for more than 700 years. They had read the prophecies dating at least 700 years back of the coming of the Messiah. These are called messianic prophecies. And now, what they had been hoping for, dreaming about, evidently, now it's here. More than evidently, this is Jesus, the Christ. And he had proven himself on many levels, on the level of his teaching with authority, on the level of his signs, wonders, miracles. And on the disciples observed Jesus more than anybody else. I mean, that's kind of the pretext of, or the backstory of the Chosen video series. It's all about the backstory. Not all, but mainly. Okay. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, or hell, will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. I'll kind of unpack this whole thing. This was a truth revealed to Peter by God himself. And then he goes on to this next statement has been misunderstood, I think. And it I think is the source of the papistry, of the Pope. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Now, the Catholic doctrine is that Peter was the first pope, and Jesus had designated him here. Don't think so. I think what he was saying is, and it requires some interpretation, I admit that, but I think what he's saying is that statement, that's the cornerstone on which the church is founded, that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Well, on this rock, Jesus said, the rock of Peter or the rock of his confession. I choose to believe the rock of his confession. I will build my church. I'm going to come back to that, because the idea of building is very process oriented. Well, okay, used up my time. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.